I'll start out basically talking about the iPhone, specifically that case, and I'll try and expand and generalize a little bit in terms of the technological issues. I'll also get a little bit into the encryption in transit and at rest issues. I won't go into a whole lot of technical, like super technical detail, but if you have questions on that, feel free to ask me if we have time for questions now or afterward. But basically, as was mentioned in the beginning, the issues with the iPhone started out with three particular issues that the FBI was having. One is that the pins actually had to be input by hand. So if you think that there's a large number of pins, you're going to have somebody, maybe your intern sitting around for a good portion of the summer trying different pins, one at a time. The second issue is that, as was mentioned, incorrect guesses could cause a delay to be introduced into the lock screen. These delays are not 1 or 2 seconds. These can be minutes or more. So that's something that could cause guessing one of these correct pins to take a very long time. And third, and most troublesome for the FBI, is that the phone could hypothetically be set to automatically wipe the contents of the phone if there are too many incorrect pins that were entered. So that was certainly the biggest issue, would be the loss of evidence. In terms of the types of contents that the FBI might have been after, they're able to get certain data that is stored and backed up in the iCloud, where a lot of data ends up at rest. And that shouldn't be a problem. Text messages may or may not be stored for a certain amount of time by the phone company, so those are another type of data that might actually be something that could be found through other means. But things like iMessage content and photos, contact information, things like that might be stored on the device and only on the device, and might be the type of data that they're not able to get elsewhere. I'll come back to that in a minute, but basically what the FBI asked for specifically was three things basically related to the problems that we talked about earlier. One, they requested that Apple bypass or disable the auto erase function, whether or not it has been enabled. They weren't sure if it had been enabled or not. Second, they wanted an ability to submit passcodes via a physical device port, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, or some other protocol, so they didn't want to actually enter in all these pins by hand. And third, they wanted to make sure that the software would not introduce any sort of delay in between entering incorrect pins. So one question is, well, why, as you asked, why doesn't the FBI just reverse engineer the code and create their own government OS and load it onto the phone? And part of the problem with that is the way the iPhone is designed. The software updates have to be cryptographically signed with an Apple certificate. So they needed Apple's involvement in signing the software update with that certificate to be able to load the software onto the phone. So that was sort of the crux of the issue. So to get a little bit into what Apple security looks like, the phone in question was an iPhone 5C. It had a little bit less security than the newer phones do now. So it would have only taken an update to the iOS, the main operating system of the phone. The newer phones have something called a secure enclave, and that's in part because Apple wanted to introduce fingerprints as a way of authenticating not only when you wanted to unlock the phone, but if you wanted to make a transaction. And one of the issues with fingerprints is you don't want a way for somebody to be able to steal the fingerprint from the phone. So you want hardware where you can put the fingerprint in the hardware and the fingerprint never comes off the hardware, but there's a way of saying, yeah, that's the same fingerprint without actually releasing the fingerprint to the external world if there's an attack. This also, this secure enclave is basically a separate, they call it a coprocessor. It's basically a separate processor with some memory associated with it that handles this. It turns out that this is also where some of the functionality for the new iOS operating system resides. So when you want to decrypt files on a newer iPhone, you actually need the assistance of this coprocessor. So updating the operating system itself isn't enough. You would actually have to update the software that's inside that secure enclave to get it to cooperate, because that's now where a lot of this functionality on unlocking and decrypting the contents of the files resides. So some of the things that were asked for in the case of the iPhone 5C now have to be asked for a little bit differently going forward. There's a question as to whether or not, I'm not really sure whether or not the software in the secure enclave can be updated, but there are indications that it can be updated through something like an over-the-air, like remote update. So if so, that wouldn't be completely impenetrable, but it does sort of add to the difficulty of getting into the newer phones. Android security is a little bit harder to talk about because it's not as consistent across the devices, so there aren't as many guarantees. As Arnold mentioned, getting into a little bit about what can be done sort of more generally in terms of data in transit, starting out there, as Arnold mentioned, CALIA, this Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, applies to telecommunications carriers, and this has been a thorn in the side of law enforcement for quite some time, because a lot of new technologies like Skype, WhatsApp, they claim that they're not telecommunications carriers, and they're not in the sense that if you try to dial 911 from Skype, no one's coming. So that's one of the things. Now, some people will claim that they should have to provide that capability. They do feel that they are exempt. They're not telecommunications carriers, but other people would like to sort of fold them into that in terms of the requirements. Now, just recently, in response to some of the things that have been going on, Apple has updated their iMessage architecture to provide end-to-end encryption. So in the past, when you sent a message from one person to another, you'd actually send it maybe to Apple. It would be decrypted and then re-encrypted and sent on to the final destination. Now, when you send a message via iMessage from one person to another, the way it works is you communicate with a directory service that Apple hosts, so you have to trust that, which is important. But then you get a key associated with the person that you're trying to talk to, and this is public key infrastructure for those of you who are familiar with it. Once you have that key, you can use it to encrypt the message, and then you use Apple's messaging service to deliver the encrypted message directly to the end user. If you trust that Apple's providing you the correct key of the person you're trying to communicate with, then the message is encrypted end to end. WhatsApp has a similar infrastructure that they've recently rolled out to ensure that they have end-to-end encryption also. I would say that this makes it incredibly difficult to break into these types of communications. These are not particularly complex infrastructures compared to an iPhone operating system like iOS or Android. So there are fewer vulnerabilities to attack on the side. There are fewer other alternate methods in. My personal opinion is this is probably not going to be a fruitful area to try to decrypt encrypted communications unless you wanted to go with an approach like key escrow, which we'll talk about in a bit. So that's sort of the data in transit issue. So